When we look at the sheer scale of global politics today, it feels entirely unprecedented. I mean, we're dealing with nuclear arsenals, state-sponsored cyber espionage, and, these hyper-connected global supply chains that can crash an economy overnight.
Right. The stakes are just incredibly high.
Exactly. So if I told you that the key to predicting whether the United States and China will actually go to war might be buried in a conflict between two ancient city-states from 2,400 years ago, well, you would probably think I was stretching a metaphor.
You'd think it was a bit of a reach. Yeah.
Right. But according to this highly influential geopolitical theory out of Harvard called the Thucydides Trap, that ancient conflict might actually be the only framework that matters right now. And that is the mission for our deep dive today. We are pulling from Wikipedia's breakdowns, academic critiques, modern geopolitical data, all to figure out if this trap is an inescapable law of history or, a flawed framework that world leaders are taking way too seriously.
And they are taking it very seriously. The term itself was coined around 2011 by an American political scientist named Graham Allison.
Okay.
But it really became a sensation with his 2017 book, Destined for War. And Allison based the entire concept on an observation made by the ancient Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived around 400 BCE.
Wow, so quite a while ago.
Just a bit, yeah. Thucydides was chronicling the Peloponnesian War, and he wrote what has basically become a foundational text in international relations. He claimed that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war completely inevitable.
Huh.
So Allison took that specific dynamic, a rising power challenging an established ruling power, and termed it the Thucydides Trap.
Okay, let's unpack this because the psychology of that dynamic is actually surprisingly relatable.
Oh, absolutely.
Think of it like a seasoned veteran heavyweight champion in boxing. He's held the belt for years. He essentially sets the rules of the ring and, everyone respects his authority. But then he's sitting ringside and he's watching a young, incredibly strong, hungry rookie rapidly climbing the ranks. The tension that builds up there isn't just about who would actually win in a physical fight. It's the psychological stress of shifting power.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It's the veteran's deep fear of losing his status, mixed with the rookie's aggressive demand for the respect and influence he feels he's earned.
And why this matters to you, the listener, is because when policymakers internalize that psychological stress, when they start to believe those violent clashes are a structural inevitability rather than a choice, well, it shapes their every decision.
It becomes a lens for everything.
Exactly. This isn't just an academic debate happening in some university faculty lounge. When global superpowers view your safety, your economy, and your future through this fatalistic lens, it dictates the security of your supply chains, the stability of your retirement accounts, and whether your country gets dragged into a devastating global conflict.
Right, because they're looking at everyday trade deals or tech competition as pre-war maneuvers.
Yes. A hegemonic transition isn't just about redrawing a border on a map. It's about rewriting the rules of global finance and trade. So if leaders believe the veteran and the rookie are destined to fight, they act accordingly.
Okay, so if that structural stress is real, we have to look at the historical scorecard. I mean, does this specific anxiety actually lead to violence?
Well, Graham Allison backed up his theory with a massive study at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs.
Okay.
They looked back over the last 500 years and identified 16 distinct historical instances where an emerging power rivaled a ruling power.
Just 16.
16 major cases, yeah. And out of those 16 cases, 12 ended in war.
Oh, wow. 12 out of 16.
Which is a 75% failure rate for peace. And when you look at Allison's table from the study, the examples cover a vast array of geopolitical conditions.
Like what?
Well, you have the mid-19th century, for example, where France and the United Kingdom, acting as the ruling powers, faced a rising Russia. And that ultimately culminated in the Crimean War.
Okay, but the study also documents the 4 instances that didn't end in direct war, right?
Yes, it does.
Like in the early 20th century, a rising United States rivaled the reigning global hegemon, the United Kingdom, and that transition happened peacefully.
Right, the U.S. essentially took the baton.
Yeah. Then, from the 1990s to the present, you have the UK and France navigating the rise of a reunified Germany without firing a shot. And the Cold War is a fascinating outlier, too. From the 1940s to the 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union engaged in massive proxy and economic conflicts, but they managed to avoid a direct, hot war between the two principal powers.
They did, but those peaceful transitions required extraordinary circumstances. And that really highlights why the 12-16 statistic is so alarming to modern diplomats.
I mean, I have to push back on that statistic, though.
Sure.
16 cases over 500 years feels like a pretty small sample size to declare a universal rule of human nature. Human history over half a millennium is infinitely complex. It just feels like we might be cherry-picking a handful of conflicts to fit a very catchy narrative.
And that skepticism is widely shared among historians. You're definitely not alone there. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the concept of a hegemonic transition, the reason Allison's 12 out of 16 figure terrifies policymakers isn't because it proves an absolute law of physics.
Right.
It's terrifying because it suggests the default gravity of a hegemonic transition pulls heavily toward conflict. It implies that avoiding war isn't just a matter of maintaining the status quo.
You have to actively fight against it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To overcome that 75% failure rate, it requires massive, conscious, and intensive diplomatic exertion. If you simply let the structural stress play out naturally, the historical default is bloodshed.
Yikes. So if conflict is the default, then looking at Washington and Beijing right now is terrifying. Because we aren't just dealing with a historical hypothetical here, we are watching the two biggest economies on Earth step right into this exact structural dynamic.
Absolutely. In modern foreign policy, the Thucydides Trap is almost exclusively used to describe U.S.-China relations.
Really? Almost exclusively.
Yeah. Scholars like Hal Brands and Michael Beckley note that it has become canonical. It is a truism invoked ad nauseum to explain the rivalry, and that framing goes straight to the absolute top of global leadership.
Right, like Xi Jinping talking about it.
Exactly. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has explicitly referenced the term, cautioning that both nations need to work together to avoid the trap. During a May 2026 summit, Xi reportedly even asked U.S. President Donald Trump directly if their two nations could manage to bypass it.
Wow. And when you look at the board today, the tripwires for this trap are everywhere.
They really are.
Take the South China Sea, for example.
Yeah.
It's not just a dispute over territorial waters, it's the mechanism of the trap playing out in real time.
Yes.
The U.S. sees its freedom of navigation patrols as maintaining the reigning international order. But China views those same patrols as a containment strategy, denying them their rightful sphere of influence.
Right. Two completely different narratives.
Yeah. Every naval maneuver isn't just a ship passing by. It's a test of who writes the rules. And then you layer in the U.S.-China trade war, which was accelerated by tariffs from the Trump administration.
Right.
It stopped being just about economics and morphed into a struggle over technological dominance, with both sides utilizing digital policing and cyber espionage.
It's a very long list of friction points.
It is. You add in the continued de facto independence of Taiwan, differing policies toward North Korea, major human rights issues in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, and then Xi Jinping's consolidation of power.
It is a staggering list of genuine high-stakes disputes, and the sheer volume of these disputes is exactly why Allison's book has become required reading for policymakers, academics, and journalists worldwide.
Because it simplifies it all?
Yes, it offers a clean, unifying theory to explain all these disparate conflicts under one umbrella.
But, I mean, if both Xi Jinping and U.S. presidents are openly talking about this trap, doesn't the term itself become a self-fulfilling prophecy? Are they preparing for a war just because a Harvard book told them it's highly likely?
That is the profound danger of fatalism. When the literal framework of your international relations is built on a tragedy from 400 BCE, you fundamentally alter how you interpret incoming data.
Right. You see what you want to see.
Precisely. If you believe a clash is the structural rule, you stop viewing the other country's actions as solvable diplomatic disputes. Instead, you interpret every single trade tariff or naval exercise as proof of inevitable war. You stop looking for creative modern solutions because the historical model tells you those solutions are futile.
Okay, but what if the entire premise of applying the Thucydides trap to the U.S. and China is actually diagnosing the wrong disease?
How do you mean?
Well, the whole theory assumes that China is this unstoppable, limitless rising power that will inevitably overtake the United States. But a growing school of scholars argues the exact opposite, right?
Yes, they do. Scholars and analysts like Arthur Waldron, Ian Baruma, Hal Brands, and Michael Beckley forcefully reject the idea of China as a boundless, rising juggernaut.
So they think China's actually weak.
They argue that China is facing structural headwinds that make it far too weak for the kind of hegemonic conflict Allison is predicting.
Because they point to some severe vulnerabilities, like China is dealing with a rapidly aging population, an exodus of citizens, profound domestic ecological problems, and massive vulnerabilities in its real estate and economic sectors.
Right, the economic slowdown is a huge factor.
Yeah, and on top of that, a strict censorship regime fundamentally limits the kind of open innovation needed to dominate the 21st century. And militarily, they argue China still operates with an inferior force relative to the U.S. and relies on a significantly weaker system of global alliances.
Exactly. And Harvard political scientist Joseph S. Nye introduces an entirely different framework to understand these vulnerabilities, which he calls the Kindleberger trap.
The Kindleberger Trap. Okay, what's that?
This theory flips the script. It suggests the real danger to the global order isn't China's meteoric rise, but rather the prospect of a weakening China. If domestic crises cause China to turn inward or fracture, it could become a fragile state, unable to provide global public goods, secure its massive supply chains, or maintain internal stability. A massive power vacuum created by a faltering China could be far more destabilizing to global security than a strong, confident China.
So, what does this all mean? Let me put it in the context of a poker game.
Okay, I like poker analogies.
The Thucydides Trap assumes the biggest threat in the room is the guy across the table who is confidently winning hand after hand. You're watching his chip stack grow and you're sweating because he's going to take over the table.
Right.
But the counter theory suggests the most dangerous guy in the room is actually the one who just realized he's going bankrupt, panics, and decides to flip the entire table over.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the alternative theory put forward by Brands and Beckley. What's fascinating here is that they argue the Thucydides trap fundamentally misdiagnoses where China is on its arc of development.
Right.
In their view, the most dangerous trajectory in world politics is not a steady, confident rise. The true danger zone is a long period of growth, followed by the sudden, terrifying prospect of a sharp decline.
Because when a country hits its peak, maybe their economy suddenly slows down, or their aggressive behavior provokes a massive coalition of rivals to team up against them, they realize their window of opportunity is slamming shut.
Exactly. The psychology shifts from limitless possibility to imminent panic. And history strongly supports this pattern. Revisionist powers nations trying to violently shake up the existing global system rarely lash out when they are booming and confident in their future.
They lash out aggressively when they stagnate.
Precisely. Brands and Beckley point to Imperial Japan and the build-up to the Russo-Japanese War.
Nah.
Japan didn't attack because they felt invincible. They attacked because they feared their window to secure resources was closing.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
They also point to modern-day Russia under Vladimir Putin as a textbook example of a stagnating power acting recklessly to grab what it can before demographic and economic decline makes it impossible. They fear China, facing a slowing economy and growing global resistance, might fit this far more volatile, panicking pattern.
Wow. Shifting our fear from a rising power to a stagnating power is a massive paradigm shift.
No.
But the critiques of the Thucydides trap don't stop at its modern application to China, do they?
No, they go much deeper.
Because if we dig into the actual historical data that Graham Allison used for his Belfer Center scorecard, the foundational methodology of the trap itself starts to crumble.
It really does. Let's examine World War I, which Allison categorizes as a classic manifestation of the trap in emerging Germany, rivaling a hegemonic United Kingdom.
Okay.
Historians like Joseph Nye and Lawrence Friedman argue this fundamentally misidentifies the mechanics of the conflict. World War I wasn't a simple two-player game of structural anxiety between London and Berlin.
That was a huge mess.
It was a massive multipolar pileup. Germany was terrified of a rapidly industrializing Russia. You had the terror of rising Slavic nationalism destabilizing a rapidly declining Austria-Hungary. It was a web of disastrous mismanagement and rigid alliance structures, not a clean binary of ruling power trying to suppress a rising one.
It's like trying to explain a massive 10-car pileup by only analyzing 2 of the drivers while completely ignoring the icy road, the shattered traffic light, and the 8 other cars involved.
That's a great way to put it.
And the historical takedowns continue. Take the Russo-Japanese War. Allison frames it as a rising power, Japan, rivaling a ruling power, Russia. But historian Arthur Waldron points out the mechanics are all wrong for Allison's model.
How so?
Well, Russia didn't launch a preemptive strike out of fear to hold on to its dominant status. The rising power, Japan, launched a surprise attack that scuttled the Tsar's fleet.
Right. But the most devastating blow to the theory, however, comes from the classic scholars. These are the experts who have dedicated their lives to studying the very foundation of this entire concept, Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War.
Which is just a massive irony here. The entire theory is named after Thucydides, yet if you look at the scholars who read Thucydides for a living, they argue Allison completely misread the original text.
Completely misunderstood.
So policymakers are using a 2,400-year-old blueprint to navigate a modern nuclear standoff, but the architects of that blueprint are telling us it was drawn upside down.
Exactly. Scholars like Donald Kagan, Ernst Badian, and Jeffrey Crean argue that Allison profoundly misunderstood the core lesson of the conflict. Athens wasn't just innocently rising and triggering Sparta's structural insecurity.
Right.
The turning point of that war was the Syracuse expedition, which had absolutely nothing to do with unavoidable structural traps. It was a massive, unforced error driven by Athenian hubris. Athens attempted a disastrous conquest of Syracuse, an objective incredibly far away from any of their vital interests.
So it was a failure of internal politics, not some sort of external gravity.
Yes. Academic Jeffrey Crean stresses that for Thucydides, the Syracuse expedition was the ultimate warning about democracy devolving into mob psychology. The Athenian assembly got swept up in expansionist fervor, overextended their military, and got their fleet decimated.
Oh.
Political scientists point out that the war wasn't an inadvertent escalation at all. Sparta made a highly rational, calculated decision that, given Athens's massive internal blunders, going to war was a strategic risk worth taking. Thucydides' actual lesson was that the greatest threat to a reigning power usually comes from its own internal hubris and mismanagement, not from the rising challenger.
Which perfectly explains why James Palmer, deputy editor at Foreign Policy, wrote a piece hilariously titled, "Oh God, not the Peloponnesian War again."
That is a great title.
He derisively noted that conflicts between city-states in a backwater Eurasian promontory 2,400 years ago shouldn't, and I quote, hold the same grip on international relations scholars that Harry Potter does on millennial readers.
The critique is biting, but it highlights a crucial flaw in how we consume geopolitical analysis. Scholar David Dokuyi Lee makes the point that applying ancient Greek analogies to modern Asian superpowers is inherently flawed.
Because the cultures are so different.
The cultural, economic, and strategic models are entirely different. There is a profound danger in forcing incredibly complex history into neat, tragic narratives just because they sound profound in a headline. When you reduce the myriad motivations of entire nations to ruling power fears rising power, you blind yourself to the actual dynamics at play.
So let's summarize the journey we've been on today. We started with what sounded like an inescapable law of war, the Thucydides Trap. We looked at its massive influence and how it is literally shaping the vocabulary used by the leaders of the US and China. But then we systematically deconstructed it. We explored how the theory might be diagnosing the wrong threat, entirely missing the acute danger of a stagnating, panicking power flipping the table. And finally, we saw how the actual historical blueprint from World War I all the way back to ancient Greece simply doesn't support the neat binary narrative the trap relies on.
And this is exactly why navigating modern geopolitics requires you to be deeply skeptical of neat historical packages. When you read the news about trade wars or naval standoffs, don't just accept the easy, fatalistic framing that war is structurally inevitable.
Yeah, look a little deeper.
Look for the messy realities. Look for the domestic struggles, the economic fears, the aging populations, and the internal political pressures driving a country's foreign policy. It is the complex reality of the present, not a misinterpreted myth from the past, that actually dictates our future.
I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative detail from our sources. It turns out that Chinese state propaganda outlets have actively latched onto the narrative of the Thucydides trap. Yes. They are purposefully utilizing it to promote a set of global power relations that validates the idea of China as this unstoppable, rising equal destined to challenge the champion.
That is fascinating.
So here is the question to mull over. If a historical theory is proven to be scientifically and historically flawed, but an emerging superpower purposefully weaponizes that exact theory as propaganda to validate their own rise, does it actually matter if the history is fake? Or does the myth of the Thucydides trap become a geopolitical weapon all on its own? It makes you wonder, if the veteran heavyweight champion truly believes the rookie is destined by history to take his crown.
Yeah.
Does he lose the fight before he ever even steps into the ring?